questions people are interested in, say how much I'm going to, how important is the sand quality of the speech. Like imagine when we're doing the travel cost method, a drawback is that you can't decompose the attributes because we only observe one widget. Some people might say that we could try to decompose these things using contingent evaluation. We just ask people about the evaluation for sand, for air, for different parts of the beach. The thing is, will these things add up? Sometimes the answer is no, but I guess it depends a lot on the design of the surveys. A final comment is sometimes we call it a framing bias. People's answers may vary according to the context when the question is put. So there are two questionnaires. Questionnaire 1, program 1, 200 people will be saved. Program B, 33% of the chance you're going, 1/3 of the chance you're going to save. Suppose there's a medicine, there's a vaccine for COVID-19 or something. 30% of the chance you save all the people. 2/2 of the chance you can't save anyone. So it's a more risky innovation. So program A and program B, they are different. So the test on your risk attitudes potentially. And if these questions get put differently, one program would be questionnaire 2. Program X, 400 people will die for sure. Program Y, 33%, 1/3 of the chance no one will die. 2/3 of the chance all the people will die. All 600 people will die. As you can see, if I put these two questionnaires together, A and X, they're completely the same. B and Y, they're completely the same. But if I ask you, if I just administer these two surveys to a general public, which way of putting the question will help us get more votes on A and X? A and X, they're the same thing. B and Y, they're the same thing, right? So what's your guess?
I think A will be more voted.
Yeah, that's also my thinking. I guess the way the questions gets asked make A more attractive to X, although they're the same thing compared to B and or Y. Because A is putting this 200 lives as a positive, saving 200 lives in a positive way. Program X actually frames this scenario negatively about not being able to save, killing 400 people, right? I think it's a case actually. There is a study on this framing effects using these two experiments, using these two questionnaires. When questionnaire 1 was asked, program A gets 60% of the votes. And when it's asked in questionnaire 2, program X gets 30% of the votes. So you can see how the way a question gets asked matters. That's so much for our general discussion about contingent evaluation. The final thing is, as I said, about capturing different attributes, evaluating attributes. Let's take a look at a video. We're not going to cover this specifically. It's the same video channel that I showed before. So if you are interested in this, you could follow this channel for other topics as well. By surveying people about how much they got. No, I don't want to watch the contingent evaluation. It's more about choice. Evaluation, they're pretty much asking directly, what are you willing to pay to keep this like this, or are you willing to pay for this change? With choice modeling and other stated preferences methods, we aren't asking what are willing to pay directly, but asking which of these situations would you prefer. Respondents will be presented with a series of scenarios or choice sets. Each choice set has different levels of the attributes we want to learn about, and then what they choose can tell us something about how they value the individual attributes. Do they prefer the scenario with more biodiversity that comes with an increase in taxes? Their choices can give us insight into what they're valuing. The main difference between contingent valuation and choice modeling is that contingent valuation gives the willingness to pay for overall changes in the ecosystem service, while choice modeling reveals willingness to pay for changes in the attributes. You can't give us a full economic value estimate the way contingent valuation can. As an example, let's say some researchers wanted to investigate how people value some of the attributes of this nut mix. After discussing in focus groups, they found that these attributes and levels would be good to test. No raisins, little bit of raisins, lots of raisins, no chocolate, little bit of chocolate, lots of chocolate, and some realistic prices. These are all the possible combinations of these attributes that we could get. We could then pair them up randomly, giving them two options to choose from, with a third opt-out or status quo option. In this case, a do not buy a nut mix option. The status quo was added because without it, we're forcing them to choose. You might still be able to get a feel for how people value the status quo alternative if you had it mixed in, but we need to be with every choice that the choice resembles a market choice. This way, when they pick, it's not just their favorite scenario. We know they are willing to pay for that and those attributes. We don't know how much people value these attributes, except the money they have to pay, but what they pick gets us closer. If they pick this, for instance, we know that the net value they feel they're getting from the mix is greater than the net value they feel they're receiving from the other choices. And we're learning about how they value the individual attributes. For example, with this set, for the same price they chose this one which had more raisins rather than the one that had more chocolate, suggesting their value for raisins is higher. Each respondent is given a few choice sets that gives us more insight, and should be able to let us know quantitatively why they're choosing what they're choosing. It's kind of like hedonic pricing. We are looking at the attributes people are choosing and the prices they're paying, and estimating how much of the value is because of the attributes. One benefit of choice modeling is that it can avoid another kind of bias. When people are faced with the option of giving or stating how much they would give, with people watching, there's a social pressure to say yes, but that's not really what we're trying to measure. It's a yay saying bias. With choice modeling, we won't have this problem as much because it's not will you give, it's hey, which of these situations do you like. It's maybe easier to separate that choice from a social obligation. And this may also make it less prone to the warm glow effect, although choice experiments have limitations too. When faced with too many choice sets, respondents can get bored or fatigued with the format. If there's too many attributes, they may be ignoring most of them and only focusing on a couple of things that are important to them. Our analysis doesn't factor that in, we'll get an incorrect estimate. As an example, 2/3 of the Morita wetland in southern France was lost mostly between 1900 and 1983 to agricultural expansion. By 2011, the costs of this were waning. They experienced some water quality problems, flooding problems, increasing drainage costs. Also, some of the financial aid for cereal production was lost, and the area was designated as a 2000 nature area. This gave reflection on the current use of the land for agriculture, but there wasn't any consensus on what to do. Turn some of the area into wetland again, do nothing, how much focus should be placed on recreation. If reclaiming the wetlands, what about mosquitoes? The researchers wanted to get the public's input on the future configuration of the landscape to give some insight to policymakers, and they used the choice modeling survey. These were the attributes and levels they ended up looking at. An option with no additional hedges, an option with some additional hedges which would improve wind block, shade, hydrological properties, and increase habitat for animals, and another option with even more hedges, giving them even more benefits, but would block the view of mountains. There's keeping the wetland the size that it is, returning it to 1/3 of how big it was in 1900, or 2/3 of its original size. Biodiversity, no increase, some more, lots more. Recreation, no access to the wetland, and only access to a publicly owned stake, what they're calling passive recreation, with a trail around the outside, but no hunting would be allowed, or active recreation, where access to the wetland is allowed with additional trails into the wetland, also hunting is allowed. There's no mosquito control, control with a BT toxin, or biological control using fish and other creatures, and the per person increase in taxes per year. But remember, this isn't a vote and they're asking the public's input. They're going to be throwing combinations of these attributes at respondents and analyzing their responses to tease out their willingness to pay for the attributes. With the number of attributes and levels they picked, there was 1,458 combinations they could got. Maybe it would have been nice to test them all, but it's not necessary and would require a huge sample of people to survey. They can still include all the necessary combinations of characteristic levels to learn the main effects the different levels in their combinations have on respondent choices, using a much smaller number of combinations. They use fractional factorial design. It's a mathematical way of accomplishing that. We're not going to get into it here because it's a bit too small, but there's a link to how it's done in the description. They ended up using only 36 of the scenarios. That would be able to capture the main effects. Then the scenarios were paired, each respondent getting 9 choice sets. Each set including this status quo alternative, which involves no increase in taxes. They approached respondents on the street and in their homes. Regression analysis was used on their responses to tease out the patterns and correlations between their choices, and some of the results look like this. Because the status quo was added, you treat their responses as an expression of willingness to pay. A few things you can read from this: the respondents on average had a negative willingness to pay for a large wetland or chemical mosquito control, meaning they perceived these as negative traits. They would expect compensation if these things went through. But when paired with biological mosquito control, the willing to pay was positive, which suggests the main reason they oppose a big wetland is because of mosquitoes, and chemical control has a negative reputation. They valued having some hedges more than having lots of hedges. It doesn't make a lot of value on being able to see the mountains. Having a high biodiversity didn't seem to be a significant factor for most people, but for those who consider themselves environmental or green conscious, which was asked as a part of the survey, a high biodiversity was very important to them. So this is the kind of thing you can find out. With this information, they went on to design their management plans and estimate the willingness to pay for a given situation. In the next video, we're going to look at a method for estimating willingness to pay using primary studies as a base.
Okay, I think so this video gives us a nice overview about what choice modeling is. So you can imagine choice modeling is going to be a contingent evaluation method that asks you a lot more questions, hoping to get some estimates on specific attributes. Actually the Hong Kong study, the Hong Kong ideal harbor study, it has a little bit feature of this choice modeling. So but usually a choice modeling would involve some modeling in the end. Imagine that you're collecting all this data. You have valuation about different combinations. You need to run regression in the same way that you run regression in hedonic pricing setting to isolate the contribution of different attributes to the observed variation in elicited willingness to pay, and you need to make sense of your results. A lot of time, if you can't make sense of the results, they look weird. It's a sign that you're not asking the question in a way that should have been asked. As you can imagine, contingent valuation itself has a lot of room for measurement errors, and you're loading them with more questions. It kind of adds to the kind of mental burden for your respondents, and then they tend to fall into additional biases and basically magnify the biases that tend to exist in these kind of studies. So it's hard to conduct a meaningful contingent evaluation study. It's even more difficult to conduct a choice modeling study because at the end of the day, you want to make sense of all the numbers and your results. So a final remark about contingent evaluation study is a pretty important real life example. I don't know if you've heard of the Exxon Valdez event. So it was an oil tank that belonged to ExxonMobil, which is an oil company. There was this huge oil spill event happening in 1989. So these oil tanker pretty much crashed off the coast of Alaska, and there was huge damage. So some of the picture about the extent of the damage, the oil spilled into everywhere and killed a lot of animals. And there was a whole loads of money and efforts put into the cleaning up of the beach, the cleaning up of the coast, the restoration of animal biodiversity. So a lot of times these otters and seabirds, when they're covered with oil, they can't fly or swim. They might die of that. So the issue is that when state of Alaska sued ExxonMobil for these events, they need to settle on a payment, right? The courts need to judge how much ExxonMobil needs to pay for the public, for their damage to the public. there are direct losses, right? There are direct losses to fishing industry, which could be which could be estimated using standard tools. The fishing industry, how much fish gets killed and timed it by price. But the non-market biodiversity, or these animals, the otters, the seabirds, it's pretty hard to judge the public valuation on that unless you conduct the specific study to that and add up to that. There's this valuation on beach and on the coast itself, right? So there was this study by a bunch of Berkeley economists on contingent valuation of Exxon of these whole events. It was an expensive study. It took 18 months. It tried to be as thorough as possible, and it's actually got used as a postscript on the Exxon settlement. So the survey went as a national survey of U.S. citizens, U.S. residents, 14 minutes face-to-face, so it's an in-person interview, which happens to be the most expensive form of conducting surveys. Part 1 of the survey, the damages are shown. Basically, you're describing William Sound, which is the area, describe oil spill and effects, describe Exxon's cleanup efforts, describe wildlife and the total population, prime the respondents of what happened, and also ask about their own demographics and a few attitudes question. Whether or not they're environmentalists, what are their political stance. Part 2 of the question involves a scenario. So instead of asking things very generally, like how much do you value an otter, how much do you value a lot of biodiversity, a more realistic way is to make people think about the scenario. So here, their choice of scenario development is to asking a question about how much people are willing to pay for a project that involves oil tankers to be escorted by 2 Coast Guard escort vessels to avoid, to make sure these tankers don't crash. And even if these tankers crash, these escort vessels are able to clean up the affected zone as quick as possible to avoid massive spillovers to other areas. And this survey actually ends with usually a survey typically ends with the evaluation part. Then these people, these household residents sampled, are asked about their willingness to pay by a one-time tax. So it's not about monthly income by how many years, it's just a one-off tax. The way that the payments gets elicited is that 4 versions of the cost amounts were used, each has a different starting point. So imagine version A15 is randomly assigned to you. You will be asked a question about how much you're willing to pay. So whether or not you're willing to pay $10 as a one-off tax for this program. If your answer is yes, you will be switched to a higher amount. You continue to be asked how much, whether or not you're willing to pay $30 for such a project. So the reason that they're asking a scenario, a hypothetical scenario, about these 2 Coastal Guard escort vessels protecting oil tanks to prevent future oil tank events, instead of asking a question directly, how much do you think this damaged biodiversity or damaged beach or polluted beach is worth? So what's your take on this? Do you think can you think of reasons why these people are asking this hypothetical Coastal Guard escort vessel scenario instead of asking you directly for the current event? Like imagine you could just say, you could just state the purpose of this study, saying that what we need to know is how much ExxonMobil should pay for the damage, and we're asking you for a valuation of the damage. The reason they're asking this is they feel like your willingness to pay for this protection project tells us how much you value the coastal area, the coastal amenities, and you're willing to pay for a reduction in the risk of these tankers crash, these escort vessels are able to clean up the affected zone as quick as possible to avoid massive spillovers to other areas. And this survey actually ends with usually a survey typically ends with the evaluation part. Then these people, these households, residents sampled are asked about their willingness to pay by a one-time tax. So it's not about monthly income by how many years, it's just a one-off tax. The way that the payments gets elicited is that 4 versions of the cost amounts were used. Each has a different starting point. So imagine version A15 is randomly assigned to you. You will be asked a question about how much you're willing to pay. So whether or not you're willing to pay $10 US as a one-off tax for this program. If your answer is yes, you will be switched to a higher amount. You continue to be asked how much whether or not you're willing to pay $30 for such a project. So the reason that they're asking a scenario, a hypothetical scenario, about these 2 Coastal Guard escort vessels protecting oil tanks to prevent future oil tank events, instead of asking a question directly, how much do you think this damaged biodiversity or damaged beach or polluted beach is worth? So what's your take on this? Do you think can you think of reasons why these people are asking this hypothetical Coastal Guard escort vessel scenario instead of asking you directly for the current event? Like imagine you could just say, you could just state the purpose of this study, saying that what we need to know is how much ExxonMobil should pay for the damage, and we're asking you for a valuation of the damage. The reason they're asking this is they feel like your willingness to pay for this protection project tells us how much you value the coastal area, the coastal amenities, and you're willing to pay for a reduction in the risk of these coastal amenities. But it's kind of indirect, right? Because the line of thinking involves how people think these Coastal Guard escort vessels matter, like how these Coastal Guard vessels work. If people don't trust these vessels, they might report a lower number, not because they don't value these coastal amenities or biodiversity, it's because they don't trust the Coastal Guard. And that's a possibility. So, but then these people choose to ask this question this way instead of asking them directly for the evaluation for coastal amenities. Can you think of reason for that?
One reason could be, I don't know who did the survey, depends, because if it is done by the company that made the damage, they will try to reduce the payment of the fine or something similar. We need to evaluate something that is not standard, the damage to the environment.
Yes, sure. Who funds this survey also matters. Do you think this question will help ExxonMobil in some way? Will be somewhat in favor of ExxonMobil?
Well, if the value is low, Exxon we have to pay less.
Yes.
So here, if we do that, it will be interesting.
Yes. I guess part of the purpose I could think about asking the question this way is try to make people as impartial, objective, or rational as possible. Like imagine these oil spill event just happened. A lot of people were pretty unhappy about ExxonMobil at this moment. So if you ask them directly, how much do you think ExxonMobil needs to pay? It will come up with a large number. Instead, if you're asking these people how much you're willing to pay, you are willing to pay for a side project, a project that reduces oil spill risk. The number is more objective, but on the other hand, it works in favor of ExxonMobil. The number typically, in my imagination, would be smaller if you ask them directly for the evaluation of coastal amenities, right? So these are the numbers. So they are able to come up with percentage of people who voted yes and no at different cost. They're able to calculate total willingness to pay. They're able to aggregate this up to the whole U.S. households. And the results are basically people are willing to if you aggregate these answers up to the whole U.S. population, their willingness to pay for a Coastal Guard escort vessel program would be $2.8 billion US. And the final settlement between Alaska and ExxonMobil was about $3 billion. I don't know how these numbers are correlated. Probably they're they're in the same same range of numbers, right? Finally, the tanker ASCO program was actually pushed forward and funded by a tax on the oil industry in general. So that's the outcome of this court case as well as contingent evaluation.
So the tax, it means that it was paid somehow from the Exxon and somehow from the people, because we are talking about a tax. So if we think about the demand and the offer curve, supply curve, this means that according to the elasticity of the markets, the tax was paid by both people and the company, probably.
Yes, so that's also related to our discussion about payment method matters to these answers. Especially it's about, do you think you have some responsibility for this project, or Exxon has responsibility for this project, or oil industry has a responsibility for this project? That's so much for this discussion, and obviously there are a lot more things to think about. There are a lot more finer details to think about when you're designing a contingent valuation study. I will not cover all of that. It's just for you to understand this method. So that pretty much ends our discussion on valuation methods. Do you have other questions at the moment? Any questions for now? So there are other studies that I plan to cover, but I don't think that maybe we should cover this in our next class. So there is another stream of literature on the impacts of pollution on other kind of non-standard. It's more of a dose response study approach, but it looks at other outcomes other than the direct outcome of health and mortality. The belief is that pollution kills people, pollution makes people sick. Of course, that's the bad side of pollution, but there are other causes of pollution as well. So these are some of these papers. So one paper is about pollution affecting labor productivity, making people just perform worse during their work. There is another paper on pollution affecting the formation of human capital. The idea is that when you were kids, you were exposed to an elevated level of pollutions when you were kids. When you grow up, compared to similar kids without exposure to pollution, to the same level of pollution during their formative age, kids exposed to pollution at a young age tend to perform worse in their later life. They're less likely to graduate from college, and they're less likely to earn a high wage, controlling for other things. So the idea is that the long-run cost of pollution is substantial if you figure out the discounted value of someone earning more in the job market. The idea is probably your cognitive ability is affected a lot. Your brain, the formation of your brain is affected when you're exposed to pollution at a young age. So these are all the studies. There are studies on pollution and test scores as well. So if you're taking an important exam during highly polluted days in highly polluted areas, you are less likely to perform as well as your peers taking the same exam in a cleaner atmosphere. So there are all these studies on, let's say, it's not just non-standard outcomes, so non-health outcomes on the impacts of pollution. So if you're interested, and we have time at the end of the class, not this class, the whole course in general, I could cover some of these studies. So these literatures getting crazy at some point. There are studies on financial markets. So does pollution making traders less rational? Or is pollution making financial markets for performing worse? Something like that. Do you believe this? Do you think that pollution makes you less likely to concentrate and making all sorts of errors? And then you can apply that to test takers. You're taking important exams. You can apply that to traders. You can even apply that to politicians. Like there are studies of pollution and politicians' speech. They're more likely to make mistakes and so on and so forth when they're speaking during polluted hours. I think there were even studies on pollution and court cases. If you're a judge and you have to make decisions on a court case during very polluted periods, you're more likely to fall into some kind of biases. If you're interested, we can cover some of this paper. They can be like people are getting innovative in all sorts of outcomes they're looking into. Any questions for now?
Just a quick question about these studies. I was wondering, well, I'm sure there must be some studies out there about how they calculate punitive damages. So going back to that Exxon case, that's the amount of money that they should pay for the cleanup. But say it was due to gross negligence on Exxon's behalf or something like that, then how should they penalize them? I'd be curious to see like how much or how they calculate the punitive damages that they deem worthy. I'm sure it's probably related to similar methods or something like that.
Do you mean that basically if we work out that the damage is worth 3 billion, shall we say that Exxon is fully responsible for the 3 billion, or
yeah, so like I've seen in a few court cases over the years where say it costs you 3 billion for the entire cleanup, but because Exxon had gross negligence on their part, maybe they weren't using the right safety equipment or something, or they were just too lazy with whatever things. Now all of a sudden I'm gonna add an additional fine on top of that, basically for that gross negligence, and punitively charge them. So like, okay, well, how much should I punitively charge them to make sure no other company in the world essentially does some sort of gross negligence as well? I'm sure it's probably similar methods to how they calculated the 3 billion, but yeah, just thought I'd mention that there.
Yes, I think that falls more into the area of legal scholars other than economists, like to judge how much should Exxon pay in addition as a punishment other than the fuel damage. Or if Exxon raised the case that the weather was bad, there were just contingencies that affect the performance of my oil tankers. It's just not that I've not done a lot in safety measures. They could go back and forth in the court about how responsible they are. I'm sure these 1 plus 2.1 million is a combination of all sorts of arguments. And our contingent study is just providing one side evidence on how valuable this site, how much people value an escort program. There are a few other links you have to make from this contingent valuation study to how much Exxon is responsible for this event. So that's what I'm trying to say. So that's all for the valuation study.
And how can we evaluate the costs to make this kind of contingency evaluation? I mean, for travel method cost, we simply make some calculation about how, well, according to the area, how much we value something according to how much we are willing to pay. But to do this service, how much do we need to pay, how much it takes in terms of time and so on and so forth. So Exxon was 18 months, a long time.
Yes, you mean, I think I can't recall correctly, but I think Exxon funded part of the study. So that makes you question the impartiality of the study. But imagine this study has to be funded by someone. So that's part of the reason that you really want to look into the details of these surveys to figure out whether or not there is something fishy about this. Because imagine if this is used in a court case, either the plaintiff or the defendants are going to pay for that. Like it's very rare for a third party to pay for the full amount. So if either of this interested group is paying for a contingent valuation study, you wonder, there are just so many holes to dig in the questions to make it look favorable for one party. So that's as an outsider or as a judge, like learning economics might help you serving as a judge to just figure out how representative, how scientific these questions are when they're presented in the court. So that's part of the contingent valuation. We will change the topic completely for a while for this part. So we talked a lot about empirical studies, evaluation, regressional analysis. Now we're switching a little bit back to more theoretical models, theoretical points. So here we're talking about here we're entering more into energy economics. So energy is part of environmental economics, but it studies problems associated with the energy market as well as environment, especially environmental issues associated with the energy market. So in this specific section, we will talk about monopoly. So we talked about there are two main sources of market failure. We talked about externality. The next source of market failure is monopolist or market power. So there is one guy who set the price for the whole market. There's no competition. How would a market controlled by monopolist differ from a fully competitive market? What's the cost? What's the social welfare loss for that? The purpose of studying that is that a lot of something called natural monopolist market such as energy market, oil market, electricity market, looks very much has pretty strong influence of market power. You have a few producers who are supplying to the whole market, and they have the right of pricing. So we're interested in some kind of public policy responses to these kind of markets. It speaks more to the environmental management part other than economics part. So we will be also covering a specific case about electricity market reforms. So a lot of the countries have been talking about reforming their electricity market. How do we make the electricity sector more competitive? That's the end of the discussion. So today's plan is to start the monopolist session. Hopefully we will end it next week. So if we have time, I will allocate 1 hour to discussion about the projects. If we have time, we can do some questions as well. So we're trying to leave a little bit space here. So specifically, monopoly speaks to the fact that when we're facing the simplest case, market economy, is that we have competitive firms as price takers. A monopoly firm is a price maker. So a price taker is just the behavior of a price taker. So you go to the market, you see the price, you decide whether or not you want to supply at this price or not. That's it. Your decision is a yes or no. If the price is higher than your marginal cost, you sell your goods. If the price is lower than your marginal cost, you go back home. And typically, if everyone is thinking about this way and everyone's selling the same goods, the price will be exactly equal to the marginal cost because of competition. The monopolist problem is different. A firm is considered a monopolist when it's the sole seller of some products, and the products do not have close substitutes. So you're selling something produced only sold by yourself. So oil, electricity, that's a typical settings for a monopolist. Like, imagine you're selling a phone, you're selling a smartphone to the market. You're a sole seller for this mode of smartphone, but your smartphone has close substitutes. There are other sellers of smartphones as well. You will have some freedom of pricing differently from your competitors, but that capacity is pretty much limited. So we won't call these kind of sellers monopolists. Sometimes we call that setting monopolist competition. That's when you're a sole seller of a specific goods, but you still face competitions from close substitutes. A pure monopoly case would be you're a sole seller of a product that just doesn't have close substitutes. So usually about resources, we have why monopolists arise. We have ownership of a key resource, exclusive right to produce something. Or sometimes we have a scenario where the cost of production makes a single producer more efficient than a huge number of producers, which will come back later. So exclusive ownership of a key resource is a very important source of monopoly. In practice, the thing you can think about is the oil market. If you're OPEC, OPEC is not necessarily a monopolist because it's a group of oil sellers, oil producing organization of petroleum exporting countries, OPEC. They're a collection of oil producers, very few collection of oil producers. They are, sometimes we call this oligopolist. So you have a few sellers, not one sellers. The difference between an oligopoly setting and a monopolist setting is that the monopolist has a full power over the market, but oligopolist within an oligopoly, there are different members who might have different views. So they might undercut each other. If they form a monopolist together, if all the sellers, all the countries from OPEC think as one entity, they make decisions as one entity that maximizes their benefit, the joint benefits of this organization, they can be treated as a monopolist. But in other scenarios, or you could imagine one country think differently as the other countries. As an individual member, you have the incentive of overproducing and undercutting your partner / competitors. So there are all the issues there that we won't touch, but just to let you know about the kind of subtle difference between monopolist and oligopolist. Government created monopolist. Usually if you obtain some kind of specific right to sell, protected rights to sell, you belong to the government created monopolist. Patent and copyright are the two most important sources of government created monopolists. And there is a tension between the patent. Basically, why do we need patent laws? So in general, from the government point of view, it's a trade-off between competition, lower prices, and incentive for firms to do R&D and to do innovations, right? Patent protection of your intellectual property helps to incentivize inventors to create new inventions. Final case of final creation of monopoly occurs with what we call natural monopoly. Natural monopoly is when it is most efficient to have a monopoly in this market. Is the total cost of production is minimized when there is one company serving the whole market compared to when there are many companies serving the same market. So what would be the case you could think about where it is most efficient for a single company to supply to the whole market compared to having many different firms serving to supplying to one particular market? Typically, as I put it here, usually we call this economy of scale. So imagine that there's a return to expansion in your scale. Or your business, when your business gets larger, your average cost gets lower. Then we want the business to be as big as possible in this market. So this is a typical example of a natural monopoly. The average cost is lower when the quantity produced is higher. A specific case to justify economical scale is when you exist fixed cost of setting up the business or fixed cost of setting up the infrastructure. So imagine you need to pay a lot for an infrastructure, an oil rig, or if you're a railway company, it's very costly to build all the railway lines, but it's relatively less costly to run trains on these railway lines. Imagine it's better to have just one railway company paving all the railway lines and running operations of all the trains instead of having duplicates of different railway lines across the country. In terms of oil and gas market, probably there is a fixed cost of exploration, digging, setting up oil rigs, and that cost is kind of, you can average that cost out to your final production. Like imagine you're just paying this huge amount of money for exploration, no matter how much you produce in the end. Then the more you produce, the lower average cost you're going to get per unit of production, taking consideration of this upfront exploration setting up cost. That's the justification for economics of scale. Economics of scale is that when you expand the operation, when the quantity produced is higher, is larger, the average cost is lower. The average cost reduces in response to the quantity. Let's have a 9 minutes break until 9:10, I think. Okay, let's come back. So we talked about reasons for monopoly. So one important source of monopoly origin is what we call natural monopoly. So if you have a sector where it is costly to set up the business, it is very high upfront fixed cost and relatively low marginal cost afterwards. This sector display economic of scale. So if you're expanding the production, you're increasing the total quantity produced, the lower the cost. The lower the average cost per unit of production. Also, I've uploaded the slides, so if you need to look at the slides directly. So that creates a tension of a social planner. On one hand, a duplication of the fixed cost is wasteful. On the other hand, you don't want someone to control the market. So that naturally leads to our discussion of why market power is bad. We have a vague idea that when you have a monopoly, it charges a higher price. But why charging a higher price is costly from a social point of view, and how do we deal with that, basically? So specifically, if we figure out the demand curve for competitive and monopolist firms, if you're as a competitive firm, you are a price taker. That means that the demand function of a market to you individually. So the way you see the market is that you see a horizontal demand curve. It's basically telling you the price is $3, take it or leave it. Right? You can't change the price. You don't have your own decision is about selling or not selling. On the other hand, a monopolist, as the only seller of the market, faces the whole market. So it actually have a lot more decisions to make. So specifically, as a monopolist, your idea of your decision about selling more. So when you're facing the decision of how much you want to sell, the effects of selling more, the outcome of selling more, basically, or bringing more goods to the market, brings two effects. One is the two effects to your revenue. So imagine here your revenue is a product of price times quantity. Selling more has two effects on the revenue. On one hand, selling more brings you more revenue by quantity, right? Selling two goods holding constant the price doubles your revenue from selling one item. On the other hand, it also has a negative price effect. The more goods you bring to the market, suppose you're facing a downward sloping demand curve, will suppress the price, right? If you're the only seller of the market and you're only selling one item, the price is going to be pretty high. But if you're selling 10 items, the price will drop because you're facing a downward sloping demand curve. It means that selling more to the market, the second effect is something specific to a monopolist, but not to a private competitive market. If you're a price taker, you don't care about the price effect. You want to sell as much as you can produce. So that consideration can be formalized as the revenue function. So imagine we're writing out the revenue function as a product of price times quantity. The marginal revenue would be when you take derivative of your revenue function. So basically, an example here would be, suppose your let's write. So what's wrong here? Oh, this is for some reason. Why can't I type on the screen? It's weird. Oh, let's do it here. So imagine your demand function Q is 10 minus P. So it's a typical downward sloping demand function, right? Your revenue would be P times Q. We write it out in Q. We can replace P as a function of Q. Here, basically, P is going to be 10 minus Q. So the revenue function would be 10 minus Q times Q. It actually captures two effects, right? It captures the quantity effect. The quantity effect is when you produce more. When you sell more, you get higher revenue. The price effect is that when you sell more and you face a downward sloping demand curve, the price you will get per unit of sell is going to be lower, and it applies to all the units you've sold, all the previous units you've been selling. That's a specific problem applying to a monopolist, but not to firms in a competitive market. So here we got the revenue function. So what's the marginal revenue function? Imagine a marginal revenue function is you take the derivative of revenue function with respect to quantity. It's basically telling you when you produce 1 unit more, what's the additional revenue that you're making from this goods, right? So the problem is that the actual problem you think about as a monopolist is when I produce 1 additional unit of goods, suppose I have constant marginal cost, the marginal cost is constant, then I want to equalize marginal revenue with my marginal cost. And I need to make sure that when I sell 1 additional goods, the additional contribution of this additional sale to my revenue is exactly compensated by my cost. The other way around, my cost is exactly compensated by the extra contribution to the revenue function. Here, this example would be the revenue function is 10Q squared, 10Q minus Q squared, right? So if you're taking derivative, it's going to be 10 minus 2Q. You can see the marginal revenue function is going to be different from the demand function. And when we go back to this figure, it's a typical scenario. So if you have a demand function, a marginal revenue function typically will lies below the demand function. If demand function is P equal to 10 minus Q, the marginal revenue function is something like MR equals to 10 minus 2Q, which means that the slope is going to be 2 times as the original one. And we know that the profit maximization, basically profit maximization has max profit is equal to revenue minus cost, right? So imagine if we're taking derivative of profit function, what we should have is marginal revenue equals to marginal cost, right? Instead of price equals to marginal cost. That's the difference between a monopolist, the market equilibrium from a monopolist controlled market versus a competitive market. Right, so this condition is given by taking derivative of a profit function by a monopolist. A monopoly will maximize its profit by producing quantity at a point where its marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost, instead of price equal to marginal cost. So what would happen is that suppose the blue line is the demand curve, the red line is the marginal revenue curve. You know how to derive a demand curve, marginal revenue curve from a demand curve. Basically, find the revenue function and take the derivative with respect to quantity. And you have a green line as the marginal cost function. A monopolist decision would equalize the marginal revenue function with the marginal cost function. The intersection cost, the intersection point is where this monopolist chooses to produce at. And if you follow this quantity, you trace this quantity line up to the demand curve, you're able to find the monopolist setting price. The procedural is the key intuition from a monopolist question is always that when you're making a decision of producing 1 unit more, on one hand, you are able to sell 1 unit more. On the other hand, it suppresses the price you could receive from all the units you have sold, including the previous units, because you can only sell the goods at one price to all the consumers, to all the buyers. If moving downwards towards the demand curve suppresses the price. You need to balance the fact that selling more makes the price lower. Bringing more goods to the market makes the price lower because you're competing with yourself. As the sole seller of this particular product, you're not competing with other people, you're competing with yourself. The more goods you bring to the market, the lower the price you make it for yourself. So what's your takeaway from this figure?
Well, even if monopolist has much more freedom compared to the competitive market, still depends on the demand curve to define its annual cost, to define its own price.
Yes. So the price, they are setting the price, but it doesn't mean that they have the full freedom of setting the price. They must. The price is an outcome by price maker, means the price is their decision outcome. And one specific thing to point out is that the price will always lie above their marginal cost, right? So they will earn an extra profit per unit sold because the price is higher than the marginal cost. For a competitive market, we have discussed the scenario where when there's competition, the competition will always push the price to be equal to the marginal cost. Because if you set your price higher than the marginal cost and you're earning a profit, your competitor could just undercut you by a little bit and steal the whole market from you. If you're selling the same goods, there's no point paying an extra $1 for the same goods. So this process will repeat itself until everyone has been beaten away all the extra profits and price is equal to marginal cost. But without this competition going on, a monopolist is clever enough to price above the marginal cost to earn a profit. But the idea is that it maximizes its profit, so the amount it prices above its marginal cost has a lot to do with demand condition, right? So that's the general setting. The monopolist profit is going to be a difference between the monopolist price and the average total cost. Here, the average total cost might not be the same as the marginal cost, because you could imagine the average total cost also includes the fixed cost. And if you have variable marginal cost, it's kind of complicated. We can simplify this case if we ignore any fixed cost in setting up and we assume some kind of constant marginal cost, then the profit will just be the difference between your price and marginal cost times quantity, right? If there is no fixed cost and marginal cost is constant in quantity, profit is going to be price minus marginal cost times Q. And this is a choice outcome. This is a monopoly exists to maximize this profit. The profit maximization condition gives it the specific pricing, how much you want to price above the marginal cost.
That is for the long run.
Sorry?
This is the long run profit, you mean?
Yes. Here, like if you assume no fixed cost, there's no dynamism in this problem. It doesn't matter whether it's a long run or short run. So imagine there is a profit, there is a fixed cost, then your profit would be profit every year minus the fixed cost in the first year if it happens, if these operations happen over a long time span. But one thing I need to emphasize is that fixed cost only matters for your decision of entry, your decision of whether or not I want to enter into this market. It doesn't affect your pricing rule. The only cost that's relevant for your pricing rule is the marginal cost, right here. Because the fixed cost, when the fixed cost enter into the profit function, is going to be differenced out. When you're taking a derivative of the profit function, your fixed cost will look like a constant term, and it drops when you take first order condition to your profit condition. So how much you spend on setting up the electricity infrastructure, how much you spend in setting in oil exploration, in setting up the oil rig, doesn't matter how much you're going to price the oil. What matters about pricing the oil is how much you pay digging out per unit of oil after you have set up the whole plan. But that cost matters about your decision of entering into this market. If the upfront fixed cost is too high, it's not enough to cover your final profits every period, your per period profits in the later periods, you would not choose to enter this market. So what's the welfare cost of monopoly? So imagine you're looking at this figure, and I'm asking you. We say that it's a market failure to have market power. If there is we call this market failure, it must mean that the outcome is not efficient. When the outcome is not efficient, it must mean that there will be a deadweight loss associated with this problem. Now the question for you would be, how do you identify the deadweight loss in this problem? So what's going to be the efficient outcome in this setting?
I think if we could, I don't know if I'm correct, but if there was no monopoly, we should have the maximum selling when the average total cost meets the demand, isn't it?
So in a competitive market,
we should reach
is the average total cost that matters, or is the average cost matters, or it's the marginal cost that matters? We know that in a competitive market, basically you have demand curve meeting supply curve. So how do you get the supply curve?
Should be the marginal cost. Yeah, average. Remove the fixed one, so it should be the marginal cost.
So it should be where the blue line meets the green line, right?
Yeah.
So this point will be the efficient market outcome. So the difference between an efficient market or a competitive market from a monopoly is in a competitive market, the price is lower, and more goods are supplied. And so the benefit would be it allows some consumers who have relatively lower willingness to pay for these goods to enjoy these goods. But in the monopolies world, the price is too high that some consumers, even if their willingness to pay is higher than the cost of production, the marginal cost of production, because of the pricing, the fact that price is set above the marginal cost of production, these people cannot enjoy these goods. And realize their positive social benefits, let's say. So how do you identify the deadweight loss from this problem?
A, B, and that
it should be this small triangle, right? The deadweight loss usually looks like a triangle in these figures. You're right. So deadweight loss occurs in this problem because less quantities, because the less goods are sold to the market because of higher price. So for each unit, so if we move from the monopolist world to the efficient world, more goods are going to be sold, and one extra unit of production, one extra unit of supply brings in extra benefits, amounting to the value of the difference between marginal willingness to pay of marginal consumers and marginal cost of producing, marginal cost of production, up to the point where they're equal to each other. So that's how you figure out the deadweight loss area, right? So as I said, in contrast to a competitive firm, the monopoly charges a price above the marginal cost. From the standpoint of consumers, these high price makes this monopoly undesirable. However, from the standpoint of the owner, the higher price makes monopoly very desirable. So you can imagine this is a scenario where the monopolist takes away a large share that used to belong to the consumer surplus, and meanwhile it makes some consumers who would have enjoyed the goods can't afford it under the higher price. So the consumers loss and monopolists gain in profits somewhat cancel out, apart from this point, apart from this purple triangle, which is what we call deadweight loss, right? So how to figure out deadweight loss, the amount of deadweight loss in the monopolist problem. You just figure out, you start from the demand curve, derive the marginal revenue curve, figure out the monopolist quantity, which leads you to the monopolist price following applying the demand curve, and then that pretty much tells you about the price, the difference between price and marginal revenue at this specific quantity, right? So don't worry, we will work out some of these questions, solving for monopolist question. So that's so far we talked about monopolist pricing rule. As a monopolist, you have some freedom of pricing, but you don't have full freedom of pricing. You are the competitor of yourself. You need to balance out the fact that when your price is too high, too few goods get sold. That affects your revenue. But if the price is too low, but if it's not too much, the price is too low, it also hurts your revenue. So you need to find the right balance. From the public point of view, so if you're standing in the shoes of the government, what's your view of monopoly? Obviously, it hurts the social welfare by when they're charging higher price. Of course, they're hurting the consumers. But even if you don't care about the consumer, specifically, you care about the joint benefits of both the sellers and the buyers. A monopoly is still counterproductive because too few goods gets produced and supplied to the market. So there are several choices of public policies towards monopoly. A specific type is what we call basically reintroducing competition into this market. Antitrust law. So I think basically in the US, there was this famous case where Microsoft was sued by Department of Justice about antitrust. The decision is about whether or not Microsoft was a monopolist in the operating system. And I think eventually the case went forward as Microsoft paid a large amount of money because of monopoly. So antitrust law is one way to address the monopolist issue. It helps the government. It gives the government several justifications to prevent mergers, to break up companies, to prevent companies from performing activities which makes the market less competitive. Can you think about examples of antitrust laws that you're aware of?
Honestly, I was thinking about sealing the way, but I don't know if there is any law.
I know there's some laws out there that prevent mergers from going through, giving companies basically too much power.
Yes, indeed. They want to prevent mergers, and if a company grows too big, they need to separate the firms into different divisions. I think a famous case was about Standard Oil. So we know there are different oil companies. There are Shell, there are ExxonMobil, there are forgot the names of all these companies. They used to belong to one big giant conglomerate called Standard Oil. It's owned by Rockefeller. At some point, the U.S. government said that you're just too powerful, and it broke the Standard Oil into multiple companies who are supposed to be competing with each other. So if you are interested in antitrust and what are the justification for market power, this economic analytic framework will help you a lot. So one idea is just to look at their market share, right? If a company is selling at a share that's predominantly high, it's a sign of monopoly. And another idea is to look at how much this company price above its marginal cost. I need to collect some data about the price and figure out whether or not the price is competitive. And a lot of time, the idea is not just about a company taking over the whole market. It's more about companies colluding with each other. So they act as a monopolist. So imagine that you have two companies who seem to be independent, but they are making the decisions about maybe they have the similar owners, maybe they share some they just collude, and then they're setting prices above their marginal costs. It's for the government or for the Department of Justice to look for these kind of potential collusion cases, and figure out specific ways of doing of either breaking them up or find them for collusion. Another idea is about regulating the behavior of monopolists. So imagine that you are you face the case of natural monopolists. So you have a market which tells you that it's more efficient to have a monopolist instead of having different companies operating in the same market. Like suppose it's a railway sector, it's better just to have one kind of national-owned railway company. So there are two options for natural monopolies sector. So one option is just the government try to nationalize this specific sector, right? For a lot of countries, the electricity sector is state-owned, the railway sector is state-owned, oil sector for all countries is state-owned as well. So that helps the government to act as a price setter, a price maker. And if you believe the government would do something good compared to a private firm or private monopolist, they will set a price at the marginal cost. Alternatively, the government could choose not to own the firm, but just order the firm to do what it should do, like saying something like, I know your marginal price is at $20 per barrel, $20 per kilowatt hour. You need to price at this price at this level. You can't just tell me that you're charging a higher price. I know what your marginal cost is. Just charge your consumers at the marginal cost. So what's the specific issue about that kind of regulation? So imagine you go to a natural monopoly and say something that you should charge your consumers at exactly the marginal cost.
Well, you're going to remove a monopoly and to transform it artificially in a competitive market, something like that?
Yes. You just say, pretending that you know, the government pretends that it knows the marginal cost. I think a lot of times it's you have some idea about marginal cost, and you just ask the producer to sell at the marginal cost. Right. In that way, you solve the problem of a monopoly kind of artificially by achieving a competitive market outcome in a monopolist market. Of course, the issue would be that if you are asking the firm to price at its marginal cost, the firm is basically making no profit, making no variable profit at all, right? So for each unit of production, it's not earning any profit. But if the firm actually has a fixed cost in setting up the whole plant, so basically you have an upfront fixed cost, exploration, setting up the rig, paving the railway lines, paving the electricity transmission lines, all these basic down payments, let's say, cannot be recovered by the company. Usually, if it's the private market setting, the company is earning positive profit during its operation. It's earning positive profit. It's earning positive variable profit from its operation. It has the potential of covering all its fixed costs. But if you're ordering the company to price at the marginal cost, you are forbidding this possibility. You're just asking the firm to make a loss. The firm is necessarily making a loss as a result, right?
Excuse me, but we are considering business profit or the economical profit in this case. If you're considering economical profit,
it's a profit to the firm, right? Considering from the standpoint of the firm, if you are this kind of firm, the government says something like you're supposed to be pricing at the marginal cost, your direct response would be then I will be making a loss, and if I'm making a loss, I will be exiting the market, right? There's it's not exiting, it's I will never enter this market if I know that's what's happened, and the government needs to think about the potential effects.
I agree. I was thinking that if it is a business profit, it will be definitely a loss. If it is economical profit, it means it is more profitable rather than another business.
It's more like if you think about the social welfare, there has to be an improvement of social welfare, moving to a more efficient outcome. But what happened is it's a game played by the government and the firm. The firm could just say, if that's what the regulation looks like, why would I ever enter this market? So a lot of the case, the scenario to regulating behavior of monopolies usually turn into scenario 3, which is the government kind of nationalize a lot of private businesses, especially in a natural monopolist setting, and the justification for that is if you can't have the firm in a natural monopoly setting, which is the setting where you have a huge upfront fixed cost of setting up. If that's the case, basically what you have is the average total cost will always lie above the marginal cost, right? No matter how much you produce, your average cost is going to be higher than your marginal cost. So basically the profit, the net profit should be P minus ATC times Q. ATC is average total cost. So eventually, if P is P is higher than P is equal to marginal cost, and ATC is always higher than marginal cost. ATC is always higher. It always lies above marginal cost because it shares the fixed cost. ATC is pretty much, if you want to be rigorous and write out everything, total cost is going to be fixed cost plus. Imagine this is a constant marginal cost setting. It's going to be a constant marginal cost times quantity. So average total cost is going to be fixed cost divided by Q plus marginal cost. It's going to be a curve that always lies above the marginal cost curve, the dark blue one. The gap between ATC and marginal cost is going to be smaller as quantity increases, but eventually you will always have the monopolist always a loss, right? Whenever there's a fixed cost, asking the firm to price at the marginal cost always leads to a loss. So from a public policy point of view, what would eventually happen in the end is that the government would say, I will cover your cost. But then it typically looks easier for the government just to buy out this private company. So that's why you see a higher share of state-owned enterprises, national ownership in sectors which look more like a natural monopolist sector with upfront fixed cost, with economic of scale. That's part of the justification. So the final public policy towards monopolists is what we call doing nothing at all. So sometimes leaving a monopolist alone, allowing them to earn some profits might not be a bad thing. Can you think of a scenario where the government figure out that we should just let the monopolist earn some profits? It might not always be counterproductive.
I don't know, luxury stuff.
Luxury stuff? Why is that?
I mean, if I was thinking about if we have a fundamental good like food or like electricity, and the demand is inelastic, if we don't control the monopolist or nationalize the company, there will be a big loss for the customers.
So you mean the setting where the government don't care about customers? They probably care more about the producers, and it's better to have the producers earn. It could be part of the justification, right? Another more important justification is when you look at patent and copyright. As we said, patents and copyrights are basically government-created monopolies. Their monopolist power is actually created by the government and protected by the court, basically. And the motivation for that is just to try to incentivize people to innovate, to incentivize people to be creative. So imagine if you're a potential inventor, you said that I have this brilliant idea, I spent a lot of time, I ran 1,000 experiments, a lot of trial and errors to come up with this final plan. The final plan is very simple. If you look at it, you know how to do it, but you basically discover this final solution is not a simple thing. If that's a setting, and this idea is not protected, an expected scenario is once your idea became public, when you start selling at the market, a lot of copiers will follow. They will become your competitors, and they will take your profits away as soon as possible. So that reduces your profits. So imagine the profits you could earn from the market dissipates like 2 months after you enter into this market. You created the market. 2 months later, your profits gets dissipated, and your profits just can't cover all these efforts, errors, failed experiments you ran before. So you will never just. It kills your incentive of trying new things. The patenting system exists to ensure some short to medium run profits of creators or inventors in exchange for their incentive of doing innovations. But of course, the government wants the length of the patents, the intensity of protection is an interesting public policy area. The government needs to figure out the best balance between giving these people some incentive of innovation without hurting the consumers too much, because granting the monopoly power always kills consumers, not always hurts consumers. And this is a hot debate pretty much in the pharmaceutical scenario, right? That's the case where it applies a lot. There's a lot of ethic discussion, like the medical companies, the medicine companies, all these pharmaceutical companies, they charge pretty high prices for new medicine. The reason they're charging high prices is because their invention of these new medical is patent protected. That's their power from charging high price. If you just manufacture the same pills with the same chemical formula, it's illegal, and you can't do that. But in that way, it's hurting the patients, right? Some patients might just can't afford paying this high medical price. So that's the tension. From a more dynamic point of view, asking this medical company to price the marginal cost will kill their incentives of innovating or finding the right formula at all. So as you can imagine, medical trial is very expensive. You need to figure out the right formula. You need to produce the pills. You need to run this on a lot of people, gather your data, improve your formula. It might fail completely. So you might need kind of 10 failed experiments to ensure something coming out in the end. And that's the scenario. So you can imagine all these failed experiments count at the fixed cost of developing a successful pill. So that's the scenario about the tension about this specific issue. That's all for today. So for our next class, we will discuss an application of the monopolist problem in the electricity sector, in regulating the electricity sector, and hopefully we can spend some time covering the projects. Let me know about your proposed idea and how much you are willing to speak up in the class. And I will also prepare some questions for you for exercise. So that's all for today. Any further questions?
About the presentation,
Sorry?
we need to prepare like a brief introduction of the topic, and then how we are going to present the topics that we cover.
Yes, just let me know your topic and whether or not you're willing to present. So I haven't thought about exact form of presentation. Either we do this in small groups or we ask you to present in front of the class. It's fine, like as long as I'm trying to get your own preferences on that. So that will just email me about your idea, your project, whether or not you're willing to present it in the class, something like that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
So presentation 1 minute around, you say?
1 minute. You can basically it's going to be pretty freestyle. I'm not trying to make it a presentation class. So it's about you talking about your idea and I ask some questions, the class asks some questions. 1 minute or more. I don't expect everyone to speak, so it doesn't necessarily have to be limited at 1 minute.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so that's all for today. See you next week, and I look forward to your project ideas.
Thank you.
Thank you.